So welcome everyone. Today we have Art and Meaning 1, Mood, Vibe, System, and Data Geometry with Peli Grietzer. So welcome, Peli.
Hi. I should figure out something to look at myself because my own picture is causing me ontological confusion. There we go. I'll just stare at the empty screen. Hopefully we'll do introductions in a little bit. I want to devote a large part of today's class to all of you talking about yourself and what your interest is, and what project or angle or scholarly pursuit you're coming into this topic from. Do want to start by maybe talking a little bit about what the nature of this class is, or what the motivation is. So this is a class that's about aesthetics. You might have noticed in two senses that sometimes travel apart and sometimes travel together in literary and philosophical and critical discourse. On the one hand, it's about art and poetics and how art works and how art creates meaning, and how we consume and cognize art. On the other hand, this class pushes a certain general theory of cognition in the broadest terms and tries to talk about what thought is, what apprehension or perception is, and how that relates to certain computational universals. And one might wonder, why do we even call both of these things aesthetics? Or why should they travel together? Why would it be a natural pairing to have a class that's on the one hand a theory of art class, and on the other hand a sort of generalized cognitive theory or philosophical cognitive theory class? And really, historically, I think the way that these two meanings of aesthetics, as the study in the theory of art or the evaluation of art on the one hand, and on the other hand aesthetics as sort of the broadest meta category that concerns the interaction of mind and world, or the interaction of mind, the senses, and the world. So the story of these two meanings, some of you might know. So some of you might know that the concept of aesthetics was coined in, I want to say the 18th, but it might be the 17th. No, the 18th century, by this excellent but minor German philosopher, Gottlieb Baumgarten. And he actually started off trying to come up with a theory of poetry. And he came to this idea that whereas theorists of poetry before him try to say, what is the nature of poetic beauty, he came up with the idea that poetic beauty is the perception in an intuitive way of goodness or perfection. Baumgarten had this sort of alternative idea that it's not the perception of perfection, but rather the perfection of perception. That is, Baumgarten was really the first person to push the idea that the experience of beauty in art isn't a quality of the thing being represented or the thing being perceived, but is rather a quality of the perceptual or discursive process through which the content is unfolding. So that actually led him to having to come up with a whole theory of what the nature of this process of representation or process of cognition that takes place in poetry is, because it was like, well, poetry is not quite philosophy. It doesn't deal with what Leibniz called clear and distinct ideas. It seems to involve a different kind of cognitive process or of discursive process, something that doesn't deal strictly with logical entailments, definitions, axioms, deductions, and so forth. So the way it sort of like emerged is that in order to talk about what beauty is, Baumgarten had to talk about what it is for something to demonstrate or embody excellence in cognition or excellence in discourse in that mode that isn't the mode of clear and distinct philosophical or logical thought, and that's when the term like aesthetics emerged. He coined aesthetics as being concerned with, well, essentially, like epistemology is the study of the right way or the way of excellence in philosophical and deductive reasoning with clear and distinct ideas. And aesthetics should be, this discipline that's right next to epistemology that deals with excellence in the performance of cognition in the realm that's other than that of clear and distinct ideas and logical deduction. And he called this realm the analog of reason, analogus rationalis. And he said that poetry or poetics is ars analogus rationalis. It's the art of the analog of reason. And, so then, when this term of like aesthetics was coined, it started being generalized in two very different directions in the following centuries. Within the German tradition, would often get, to some extent, detached from the strict question of poetics or art, and become a sort of proxy for sort of problem of mind and world at the interface of the senses in general. Whereas in the English-speaking world, aesthetics became more and more entangled with what used to be known before the term aesthetics was coined as the philosophical question of the judgment of taste. And then, well, with people like Immanuel Kant, you have a sort of weird, well, I want to say a little bit like clusterfuck of these two things being brought together in a what I want to say. These two things are being brought together sort of well, I don't want to say it's like Kant brought them like together like unreflectively, but certainly post-Kant, the question of here's the right way to say it. If we go back to the connection of art to both these meanings of aesthetics that emerged out of Baumgarten, aesthetics is sort of like the question of artistic excellence, and aesthetics is the question of sort of, the epistemology of thought beyond the realm of like the strictly deductive and rational. So for Kant, these two things came together in art because he thought that artistic excellence is, or the sense of beauty has something to do with recognizing the correctness or the transcendental correctness of a particular mode with which one might engage the world. And really, then, ever since Kant, making sort of like the claim that art might be somehow the locus of questions of like aesthetics in the broad sense, that is, aesthetics in the sense of the general interface of mind and world, has become very strongly tied with sort of like claims to, let's say, the objectivity of artistic taste. But that's, well, actually, I don't want to like prejudge whether that's like something historically contingent or not, but I do think that as much as this is a class that's going to be talking about art and about aesthetics in the, the generalized sense of aesthetics, the analog of reason sense, the question of artistic excellence or of like taste or of like rightness of taste is gonna keep on like haunting us in weird ways. So this is, I guess, a very short introduction to the concept of like aesthetics as this the junction of like several like different concerns that will emerge together and keep sort of like bumping into each other in weird ways. Sort of, the question of sort of like a generalized philosophy of cognition or sensory cognition or cognition of the interface of like mind, world, and senses. The question of how does art and the creation or the consumption or the understanding of art have or doesn't have a central place in the order around cognition in this general sense, and of the question of whether and how much and how this relates to aesthetics in the evaluative sense of this is good, this is bad, this is beautiful, this is sublime, this is hideous, so forth. And then, of course, and nowadays this also connects us necessarily to certain like affective categories that are very closely tied to aesthetic categories. And that's, I think, something that we'll get into maybe in the third week of the course. We'll start bringing in Sianne Ngai and the question of how aesthetics as cognition relates to aesthetic as evaluative judgment, and then finally relates to aesthetics as affective forms of attachment and relation to the world. Notice that I haven't said anything about computers or math, which is obviously it's like a huge part of what we're doing here, but in a way the claim that I'm going to be trying to make, or the agenda I'm going to be trying to push, is that the elements of computer science and math are going to emerge sort of like organically from thinking through these traditional-ish philosophical problems together. I want to say that sort of like when we keep all of those different like pieces of what aesthetics and the question of like aesthetics is together, the question of art, the question of artistic excellence or taste, the question of the general interface of mind, world, and senses, and the question of modes of effective reaction to the world. You know, when we keep all of this together, I think that we're going to end up finding that the math and computer science that sort of emerges as a language that allows us to talk about the relation between all of these things. So in a way, you know, I want to say in a way that this is just a class about like aesthetics in the most general sense, than the fact that this is a mathematically informed class about aesthetics in the most general sense is hopefully just going to emerge from that. So I thought maybe we can do personal introductions now. By the way, I'm Peli Grietzer. I recently finished my PhD in comparative literature at Harvard. My advisor through the dissertation was mathematics professor Tomer Schlank at Jerusalem University, the Einstein Institute of Mathematics. So I've been sort of officially interdisciplinary, although my background is much more strongly in literature and philosophy than in mathematics. So I guess we'll go left to right. Does everybody see the same order of, you know, little people icons? So, you know,
Peli,
maybe
if you want to call on people, you can. The order is different for everyone. If you want to tell us the order, you see, that would work.
So I don't have everybody's. Oh, I guess we'll start with. I guess we'll start with Yassine.
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, hello. Hi.
Can you hear me? Hi. I'm Yassine. I'm studying in art school in Geneva, Switzerland. So it's kind of late now for me, and it's actually my first class. Yeah, it's actually my first class that I take in the new center, and I'm just interested in this global topic about aesthetics and linking it to computer question because my next project is around it, I would say, but it's still like just an idea more than a project.
So you're doing you're thinking about doing computer art or like generative art or?
No, the work is more like it's more fiction and a narrative work that is about a worker that is trying to include his body into studying random fact that happened on his workplace and how this randomness could be affected by him, and this randomness could be produced by computers.
Oh, so you're doing sort of like hard science fiction from sort of like, so you're coming from the art world, but you're sort of looking to integrate some sort of like hard science fiction elements.
Yeah, kind of.
Great.
Thanks.
Can you say a little bit, you know, what your background is, you know, whether your background is mostly in philosophy or in art theory or, you know, in the sciences, or just I want to get a sense of what kind of like, you know, vocabulary everybody is or isn't comfortable with, so I know how to navigate the field.
Yeah. So it's my fourth art school. I've been studying in the UK, in France, in Switzerland, and in RISD, Providence. And before that, I was studying economy. I would say that I'm a lot in touch with philosophy, but not studying it.
Okay, awesome. So I see a TXGEN. I don't know how I would pronounce it. TXGen? Is there a TXGen in the house? I guess set? No. I'm not fully understanding why people are logged in or not. Yeah, so I guess Michelle or Mizal.
I'm not sure what's going on with them either. I would just go to the next person.
Do we have Misael? Mizal? Hello.
Yes, hi.
How do you pronounce your
Can you hear
name?
me? My cell, like my cell
Myself.
phone? Yes. So you can hear me. Okay, good.
Yeah, very great.
Awesome. I graduated from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I studied visual critical studies, curatorial studies, and general film theory. And I also have video practice. I live in Los Angeles. I moved here about a year ago, and through my sort of independent writing work, I freelance press releases and end up just writing my own critical work. And about last summer, I think, is when I found the New Center online, and I've been studying here since the fall, this past fall in 2017.
Cool. Can you say a little bit about, what your,
The fields
in aesthetics or in sort of like computation or in sort of like computers and critical theory or math and art or?
What I've been mostly invested in studying categorically has been sort of language and capital. So just reading into social economics, financial behavioral theory, and how that might relate with the cultural field of the art market and the social politics of that.
Okay, great. So I think it'll be interesting because, I don't myself sort of like practice, critical cultural theory very actively, but on the other hand, when I sort of, constructed my project, it was very crucial for me that it's going to be sort of, critical cultural theory and especially sort of like, cultural materialism compatible. So it can be sort of a good ongoing experiment for like all of us to see whether this sort of like, mathematical, philosophical, aesthetic infrastructure they try to build, actually can be sort of like effectively or successfully integrated, with like political, critical, materialist thought. Okay, great. So now we have Meredith. Is there a Meredith in the house?
Hi.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi. So I am a student at the New Center. I run. Can you hear
Is
me?
there a way I could go a little louder?
Here, how's that?
That's better.
Okay. I run a company called Print All Over Me. It's part e-commerce, part art practice. I have a technical background in computer science, and I studied philosophy many years ago as an undergraduate in some art critical theory. But I'm very interested in sort of economic experiments. Very interested in cryptocurrency and sort of AI, deep learning, the sort of philosophical frameworks around those,
Okay, great.
I have a really practical bent, so I enjoy like building, like having a hypothesis, maybe writing software to experiment with it. Is sort of what interests me the most.
That's right. I'm actually, I'm just now in the empirical stage of my work. I've been running computations like all week. So maybe we could like, we'll see. I think if you want to do some kind of like project or assignment for the class, then I can actually think of some really interesting like practical like deep learning experiments that could be done in relation to some of the material that we will be discussing.
I would love to hear your ideas about that. That sounds fascinating.
Okay, great. So are you already familiar with sort of like the fundamentals of deep learning, or?
So I am familiar with the fundamentals of deep learning. And I actually have like a deep learning study group, and
awesome.
we meet like I know it's pretty fun, and but
right.
still, it's like very seductive because it's simple, but then it's not simple, and it's all about what questions. It's all about. It's very philosophical. It's like what questions are you trying to ask? What is your question, and what method do you want to do to answer? Do you want to use to answer your question?
I think it's not accidental. The person that like drove like deep learning for like the most is someone who's like like a computer-sized competent psychologist rather than sort of like born and bred computer science person, not Jeffrey Hinton, sort of like very technically capable person. But I think someone who's like brilliance of like lies in his like psychological and philosophical education.
I totally agree. I mean, I feel, especially, I definitely believe that deep learning is going to completely change, maybe even remove a lot of traditional software development, and you're really going to be mapping interfaces, and that's all about like, it's all about sort of like relationships with the world and what is translating into what. It is more psychological, more philosophical, and less technical, or whatever it is that the skill that today we associate with programming. It's going to change, I think.
So, I think a big part of our, probably, next class is going to be, an introduction to deep learning, but it's going to be hopefully, a literary philosophical introduction to deep learning, and maybe you could, since you're already familiar with the material, maybe you could, take a more active role in that class and sort of, help lead the discussion.
I would love it. I would love it.
But I think probably a lot of the people in the class are sort of like looking forward or like hoping to get sort of like, a basic technical introduction. So that probably would be. So is Martina here now, or still no Martina?
Okay, yeah, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah. Oh yeah, because I have kind of bad connection now, but I think can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear great. I hear fantastic. I hear you, loud and clear.
Oh, is it clear? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you very well.
Okay. Yeah, so hi, I'm Martina, and I'm
Oh, wait, now I don't hear you anymore.
design architecture and computer.
So when I hear you like very well, but then you cut out. Could you maybe go again?
Wait, is it better now?
Yeah, hopefully it'll stay, because I either hear you very well or I don't hear you at all.
Now? Yeah.
Slowly, so
Okay.
we don't miss that much.
Okay, so I will try to speak all of it again.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Martina, and I'm a PhD in Prague currently, so it's a bit late for me as well. And I'm interested in intersectional projects between like fine artists, designers, architects, and like programmers and AI programmers. And like the topic of my research is called lifestyle for interspecies collectivism. I'm interested in...
Are the species human animal species, or I mean, are we talking humans and animals, or like humans and Cthulhu?
Humans and all kind of non-humans entities, all kind of non-human entities.
All right,
like,
you know, vegetable, animal, mineral.
Yeah. So
cool. So you said
also,
your background, you said, is in architecture and programming.
Yeah, and also like I graduated from like School of Fine Art, but then I started to like doing my PhD research.
Lost you again.
Maybe you could wrap up, Martina, because I think we keep on losing you.
Oh.
Yeah, you keep on coming in and out for some reason. You're
you will hear more from you soon. But, okay, so you do architecture and programming. You're sort of like interested in interdisciplinary practice.
Yeah, I'm collaborating with architects and programmers, and I'm doing mostly fine art and design.
Do you know, are you familiar with like the fundamentals of deep learning, or?
Yeah, a bit, as I worked on one project.
Okay, great. Hopefully we'll hear from you more consistently soon. I think someone here showed up. Terrence? We have Terrence now?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you.
No, I think somebody wasn't here.
I think I will.
Suddenly popped up.
I will try.
Terrence, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Martina. Sorry for the connection.
We had a person named Terrence, but now he disappeared. Leonardo? No.
We can move on. We can move on to Leonardo, maybe.
Yeah, I was hoping for Leonardo, but haven't heard from him.
Hi. Do you hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Leonardo. I have a background in humanities, and then I studied at graduate level art history / art theory. It wasn't quite clear in a way. As an editor for and architecture. So in a way, I stay across art and design, and as a
Okay, lost you audio-wise.
I
we'll get back to you.
Technology related to give knowledge is so that I think I can hear you well if you're speaking.
Leonardo, you're coming in and out. I can't hear you though.
We'll get you. Sorry. We have Jennifer.
Maybe I can type it in the chat.
Oh yeah, please do. Yeah. And Martina, if you wanted to add anything you couldn't say as well, please chat it, put it in the chat bar on the right side. And if anybody doesn't know how to use that, there's a big blue box in the top left corner. You can click on that, and then you'll see on the right side appear a chat box, and you can write anything you want in the class during our time together. Should we hear from Jennifer? Jennifer Teets?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Is it clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good.
Perfect. Perfect. I'm speaking also into the microphone of my headphones. So I'm Jennifer Teets. I'm a curator and a writer and also a researcher. And I'm working right now on a particular series that's about to be presented at the Columbus College of Art and Design at the Beeler Gallery that deals with fictocritique and tone and issues of materialism. And there's writers that I'm collaborating with there that I think there's a lot of interesting ideas that I think are reflected in your critique that that also could be incorporated somehow in that discussion. And myself, my kind of corpus is I work on metabolism and a body of work and writing on metabolism and kind of fluids and economy of fluids, and that's the kind of more intellectual content. And then also at the same time, there's a whole kind of artistic body that I do contribute with a series of revolving partners and kind of conspirators in projects. So yes, but I do write myself quite a lot and collaborate also with writers. And on the other hand, relating to the deep learning aspects of this, I mean, I teach with the SASFE Summer Institute of Art in Berlin. So there's, all the core aspects of cognitive capitalism and sort of cognition and all these, themes and neuroaesthetics. So I definitely am familiar with that. And in terms of my background, more recently, I studied it here in Paris. I'm based in Paris, actually. About, I don't know, now it's almost 5 years ago, I graduated from Sciences Po and had been formerly under Bruno Latour. So that's, some of the background in terms of education. But yeah, I definitely...
You write about metabolism?
Yes.
Of like first order organisms or of, systems that are like systems with metabolism?
Both, and the incorporation of fictocritique within that. So there are a lot of philosophical concerns that are expressed in that in fiction and those intersections. So, but also it's sort of like the matter and meaning is a springboard for my own work with certain kind of materials or we can say confrontations between the body and the mind, between, say, I've worked with goats, herds of goats, and sort of psychosomatic problems inside of cheese and stress, and or I work with a series of earths that have like a changing nature, medicinal clays, and understanding them historically and their forgotten origins, etc. So there's all this, very materialist sort of taking on to that is in a way is a inspiration for the writing, and then also the writing itself has its own confrontations and whatnot.
Let's see, we have you can introduce yourself. I can see him moving.
Hi. Hi. Sorry, I have some issues with my connection.
Oh. Wait.
I have to
Frederick.
turn off the camera.
Hello. Hi.
Yeah, yeah. I have some issues with my connection, so I have to turn off the camera, so it's better.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Well, I
Oh, wait,
studied.
Wait one moment. So like Leonardo couldn't couldn't speak because he had a connection problem. So I guess let me just like read out his bio. So Leonardo says, my background is in the humanities and art theory. Currently, I'm based in Amsterdam, where I work as an editor for Volume, an independent magazine of architecture and design theory. My personal research is developing more towards technology, in particular, infrastructure and interfaces. So,
Yeah. So can I speak now?
oh yeah, of course.
Okay, yeah. Well, I studied literature in Venezuela. I'm right now in Venezuela. Soon moving to New York. And well, my interest is the intersection between philosophy and literature, of course, and adding some like contemporary scientific and philosophical methodologies and epistemologies, like Francois Laruelle's non-standard aesthetics, stuff like that. And
I don't actually know like Laruelle's work on aesthetic. Maybe you could introduce it into the class during discussion.
Right now?
Oh no, I mean like in general.
yeah, of course. sure, for sure, yeah.
Your philosophical background is like, continental for the most part, or mixed?
Yeah, it's pretty much continental philosophy and post-structuralism. So, but I have few knowledge about analytic philosophy. Lost in that.
Okay, great. My sort of like training, to the extent I have philosophical training, is more analytic, but I sort of like try to keep an ongoing continental frame of reference going on.
That's great.
So you're interested in sort of like adding questions of computation into the like balance into the war between poetry and philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing. I don't have a lot of background in computers and programming, but I think that's like that makes a really good, a really deep level of abstraction in transversality and intersection between all those questions that I have, all those philosophical questions I have concerning literature and poetics.
That's sort of how I came to this. I was originally sort of like a literature PhD student with like a strong interest in philosophy and analytic philosophy, and then I had a roommate who was like a philosopher who was getting sort of like increasingly interested in cognitive science, and then from cognitive science getting increasingly interested in computer science, and I sort of like gradually sort of like slid from like the balance of philosophy and literature into being someone who sort of like tries to look at both of them in relation to computation, or at least in relation to some themes from computation. Actually, one thing that I hope will actually be like sort of like a theme that emerges in this class is that at least in sort of like the current like era of AI, the sort of like the language of like AI theory and sort of like the language of concepts from the mathematical foundations of like deep learning, in a way seem I don't know, more congenial to what we might call like like the poetry side in the like eternal war between like poetry and philosophy. Then at least like many sort of like more standardly philosophical vocabularies well, I think we're going to see it sort of like maybe, you know, compared to sort of like, I don't know, like first order like logic, or well, even I'm going to say like, you know, compared to sort of like ordinary English. I feel like we're going to see, or hopefully we're going to see, there's sort of like aspects of a sort of well, apparently, you know, the hot trendy like term now for like, you know, the wider like domain encompassed by deep learning is differentiable programming, because, you know, it's like working with like, it's computers like dealing with you know, differentiable rather than like discrete mathematical structures. So I guess the language, or like the conceptual language of differential programming, well, I hope we're going to discover, actually does sort of like act as a sort of like bridge language between the propositional and the pre-propositional, or the conceptual and the non-conceptual, or, you know, however, like sort of like you like to like make or unmake your like dichotomies. I feel like the sort of the conceptual space, or the discourse of like differentiable programming, sort of, yeah, I don't know, smoothed out like the territory in a really interesting way. We have some.
Sorry, was that me, Adam?
Yeah, hello.
Hi all. So my background is academically a computer science background. And in terms of my day job, I have a software and finance day job. My research interests are, again, so more like software studies, the way that the design software, the internal and the sort of external facing design, is very influenced, or inherently influenced, by all the systems around it, the people, and all of, you know, the economy and all of the other things around it. So I'm familiar with deep learning stuff, but I wouldn't claim to have used it in anger heavily. That's my background.
Cool. Oh wow, a lot of computer science in the house. That's going to be interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, it's like, you know, something that I've been like trying to do with my work is sort of, you know, I guess it's a little, no. Now that I'm about to say it out loud, it sounds like way more like predictable than it did in my head. But like, you know, I try to both like use like, you know, use computer science to talk about like literature, and use like literature to talk about, and use like literary-theoretic concept to like explicate computer science concepts. But other than stuff like, oh, everything has its like own thing to contribute sort of like way, I do think that I don't know, an important part of the like approach that I want to promote here, which seems like might be congenial to like what like inhumanism is, in like, you know, the reason Negristani sense. If I know what inhumanism in the reason Negristani sense is, I mean, like, I don't know, but I have my suspicions. You know, that it has to do, you know, it's not like anti-humanism, it's not humanism, it's about sort of like, you know, seeing like the human as part of like broader like broader classes of things, and sort of like, you know, not sort of like prejudging the separateness of like human phenomena from like non-human phenomena. And, you know, but, you know, that sort of like cuts both ways. You know, it's sort of like, well, in as much, in as much as I sort of like expect that, I don't know, if like the Heideggerian concept of like Stimmung, you know, concept is going to be sort of like central for me. You know, the Heideggerian concept of Stimmung, for those who don't know, it's this, it's often translated into English as mood. I sometimes like using vibe more than mood, although, well, I use vibe in a slightly different sense than strict Heideggerian sense. But, you know, Stimmung is like a vibe, a mood, a mode, you know, an attunement. And, you know, I think that Heideggerian concept of like Stimmung has to have sort of, you know, like mathematical correlates at like some level. That is, it seems like the kind of concept or phenomena or like structure that has sort of like such a rich relation to those aspects of human lives that sort of like have to be some level of abstraction mathematically expressible, that the concept of like, you know, like Stimmung itself should be some level of abstraction mathematically expressible. So, you know, that's, I don't know, that's sort of like the way that I approach things, but I sort of like think that like cuts both ways, and that, you know, if, you know, if we're going to think that I don't know, that, well, that should expect it also that like in that case at least, it might be that thinking in terms of like Stimmung might also be useful for like thinking about like, you know, certain kinds of like computers, like rather than just about like people, or certain kind of like algorithmic processes, or certain kind of like concepts that we already have as mathematical concepts might turn out to be sort of like amenable to also thinking about like in terms of the conceptual framing of the philosophical language of like Stimmung. Just like in terms of, you know, how this class could possibly connect with some like aspects of like software studies, is that, you know, basically, you know, when the deep learning gazes into literary theory, the literary theory also gazes into the deep learning, maybe. And you know, things like if you see sort of like, I don't know, humans as, you know, and they might be an incredibly super ultra mega special you know, member of this class with, you know, and the gulf between them and other members of the class might be huge, but still, if we see humans as members of like the class of differentiable cognitive systems, that is, say, like, you know, cognitive systems that learn at least in part through sort of like, sorry, so sorry, computer science people, I'm gonna give, you know, a very like, you know, crude like paraphrase of you know, gradient-based learning. So if we see like humans as members of the class of cognitive systems that learn through of like iterated trial, error, and parameter adjustment, then certain things that well, then certain like concepts that we have for like thinking about like humans affairs might turn out to be again possibly super mega special instances of certain concepts that you might use to think about the broader class of you know, differentiable cognitive systems. So, you know, I'd be very interested like throughout the class to actually, yeah, sort of like see how, you know, how much can we sort of like get in terms of sort of like feedback from the sort of like mathematically informed literary / critical theoretic / like philosophical discourse back into sort of like, you know, critical theoretically, literary theoretically, philosophically informed well, you know, either scientific discourse or like discourse about technology and science. That's an ear for that. Terrence? Terrence, do you want to introduce yourself? Hello.
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't hear you properly. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. By the way, if anyone can't hear me, you know, well, those of you on video, you know, like make like a movement or something, and those of you not on video, you know, Martin, he'll notify me. Also, if you want me to slow down when I'm talking, because you know, when I'm aware of my speech, I speak reasonably slow, but sometimes, you know, thoughts just line up and I just like follow, and those times I can't really even hear myself speaking, and I think it might get really fast during those times. So, you know, feel free to slow me down. Anyway, sorry. Yes, Terrence.
Yeah, no problem. I live in Berlin, and I'm an artist and writer. My interests would mainly be in human-machine dialectics, cybernetics. My background really is in contemporary art history, criticism and curatorship. I also have some education background in algorithmic audio production, kind of sound art, that kind of thing. And I guess my interest in taking this course is you've got the aesthetic side and you've got the computational side, and it's interesting to see these two things coming together in Peli's work. I'm also quite interested in what are the social and political stakes of emerging technologies, and I'm also interested in how these things in contemporary art, particularly if we're talking about aesthetics, are often co-opted and fetishized in arguably quite damaging ways. I'm also interested because Peli's ideas on aesthetics are quite fresh.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I guess because I mean, it's an interesting take on it, because I guess the last thing I probably read to do with art and aesthetics would have been Jacques Rancière's book as thesis.
Oh, that's so funny. I was about, that's the you're speaking, because there is a footnote in my dissertation that says this might or might not be exactly a computational rendition of like Rancière's thesis in the sensible. I'm frankly not sure.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, we both live in Berlin, so we should meet up and talk about the book. Yeah, so that being the last thing, I mean, that was really a very enlightening book. I mean, Rancière is, you know, it's I mean, as far as it goes in talking about contemporary art, he's one of the most relevant thinkers. But so his idea of aesthetics as an absolute regime was really refreshing for me, because I had before that been reading mainly about aesthetics from this like phenomenological essentialist point of view, which is, you know, completely from a background in sound art and listening and deep listening and things like that. So I guess seeing a transition between all that, I don't want to diss phenomenology at all, but to move from that like side of things through Ash's thesis by Rancière and into this like tying things in with computation is quite interesting for me. So that's why I've taken the class.
Yeah, mentioning phenomenology is interesting, because I recently, you know, of course, you know, like in some ways, you know, my work is like, you know, sort of like very strongly grounded in, you know, like, you know, the phenomenological tradition, just in terms of like, yeah, how much like use I make of like, in like some aspects of, you know, some sort of like light Heidegger, but then sort of like going back, you know, like many of my, well, actually many of like the Heideggerian concepts that I use are really more concepts that originally came from like Wilhelm Dilthey, and then sort of like were, I don't know, went on through international fame through Heidegger, because like Dilthey was more sort of just like known in the German sphere. But then there is a sense in which, you know, my work is sort of like, in terms of philosophical ideology, you know, just like the opposite of, well, at least of like Heideggerian phenomenology, in terms of like, you know, Heideggerian, post-Heideggerian phenomenology really stresses the idea of sort of like the I would say like sort of like the ontological autonomy of sort of like phenomenologically salient things. That is, you have this idea that it's of like a mood is a mood is a mood, right? So like the only way that you can like talk about a mood is to is sort of like through the phenomenology of the mood itself, and through sort of like an inquiry of like the mood's like being, which that's actually something that I sort of like I take to be practically true, but I sort of like at the same time I think that sort of like everything. Every discourse always has to at least sort of like show up as like a guest star and do a good job at like every like other discourse. I want sort of like my concepts of mood to at least sort of like be sort of like visible at their like contours from like from sort of like a mathematical view of the world, or from sort of like a neuroscientific like view of the world. And because recently, actually, I had a very interesting conversation recently with this brilliant, I guess, like young phenomenologist. She recently wrote like this super lauded article at N+1 about sort of like transness and radical feminism on liking women. Don't know if you've seen it. It's been setting the internet ablaze. I don't know, like
no, what's name?
It's not directly relevant. It's just like an incredibly good like article about transness. And she said it like, like we have like the exact same like sort of like philosophical like interest in sort of like wanting to do a theory of forms in lowercase letters without doing like a theory of forms in like Platonic uppercase letters. We're interested in sort of like defining what like a vibe is, what a style is, what makes like a certain kind of like a field of phenomena a totality rather than just like a collection. What is this sort of like affinity that allows certain things to come together to form gestalts? But then she said, well, but since I'm like a phenomenologist, I don't need something like a style or like a mood or like a vibe or a genre to also sort of like have like a more foundational definition in terms of like math or neuroscience or something like this. I'm just going to like, it just like is what it is, and I just like talk about it as like the thing that it is. And that's, I think, really like put into sharp like relief for me the fact that I sort of like, I don't know, the whole point of sort of like the project I'm pursuing is to sort of like both embrace that and like reject that, or I don't know, to sort of like
but what she's
around when it's like fit. Sorry.
No, but just to like relate is that this paper that you're talking about, she's positing that phenomenology is something that is you can't quantify it. It's not so she's talking about it is it's theoretical and you can describe it, but it's completely and utterly contingent. Is that what she's suggesting, or?
Oh, this wasn't like in an article. It was like conversation that we had later after like emailed her about like how brilliant the article was. That was just like, I don't know, it was like the first of like good piece in the sort of like political / personal / philosophical essay tradition I've seen in years. Anyway, no, the point was that she said that, well, I guess you can go back to sort of like the issue of sort of like immanence. She would be like, she was like, oh, like, we just like, there shouldn't be and there can't be like a mathematical theory of like mood or mathematical theory of like what mood is, because like a mood is like immanent to itself. A mood can only be like, we can only say what a mood is by sort of like, from inside, and it doesn't need to have a sort of like externally determined ontology, and ontology is determined by math or by computer science. The way that she said it, which I found it just like very striking in terms of it was like, positions I don't agree with, just like articulated very well. She was like, oh, she said like, well, what you're saying is like, oh, it doesn't matter that I can't sort of like tell you in like detail what the ingredients or what analytic definition of like the Kafkaesque is, because I can sort of like tell you that some computer can figure it out. I mean, it's like, oh, the computer knows. And I think she saw this as me wanting to sort of get the benefits of some kind of like foundationalism, right? Grounding the phenomenological realm of like vibe and mood and feel and know-how in this, godly platonic like realm of like math as like mediated by like, oh, well, it's really, really complicated math, but and we can understand it, but oh, look, this computer can understand it. And for me, I think this really made me think about the fact that like, I mean, what this really comes down to for me, I think is just like triangulation. I feel like everything should be able to triangulate with like everything else. It's like, I feel like, the phenomenological discourse can, I mean, is what it is from its like own point of view, but it should also sort of like, show up in other points of view. There shouldn't be just like, a lacuna with like nothing in it, where the sort of like things that the phenomenological discourse talks about are when you switch like to another discourse. I believe in sort of like, I don't know, some sort of minimal robustness of salience across like different discourses and different modes of inquiry. Sorry, I guess we got to this because you were sort of like drawing this off like just intuitive like dichotomy between like what Rancière opened up for you and what your phenomenological background sort of like comes from. And I don't know if this is like what you had in mind, but I think there is an element of that, I think, in Rancière, and sort of like wanting to let the aesthetic be the aesthetic, but then also sort of like move the camera around to sort of like a different order of discourse and see how the dynamic of the aesthetic looks from there. And we can play the game of like, oh, is one of them being the master discourse of the other, till the cows come home, but we can also just like not get into that and just keep sort of like panning and seeing how sort of like the space of like different discourses or like modes of like inquiry or like their like sort of like favorite domains look through like other modes of inquiry. I often say that I don't know, the sort of like method of inquiry that I'm sticking is if like Adorno like coined like I think Adorno coined the concept of like immanent critique, which is like taking down some like discourse from within. I'm into non-immanent. I'm into like external endorsements or like transcendental praise. I'm interested in sort of like seeing how certain again mode of thinking or discourses or mode of inquiry or their sort of like typical domain can sort of actually sort of like unexpectedly like re-emerge or sort of like have a lot of their contours like re-emerge from the perspective of a very different discourse. So yeah, sorry, I went a little bit of a rant here, but just sort of like you're bringing phenomenology up. I think it's really helpful here because it's sort of like it's the discourse of absolute immanence and of absolute subjective immanence. I guess the less is the discourse of the other kind of absolute immanence. So phenomenology is discourse of absolute subjective immanence. And I sort of like drawn it like so much, but then sort of like what we're going to be doing here is it's pretty much like the opposite of any kind of discourse of absolute subjective immanence. We're going to be sort of like trying to have all these subjective things reappear, you know, when we're talking in computer science terms instead of phenomenological terms, and then hopefully also when we're talking in cultural materialist terms instead of, and actually, you know, I hope that actually the computer science terms, or, you know, what we've been calling the discourse of differentiable programming, and actually, one of the things I hope is actually it can help actually with that. You know, famous like seesaw between the sort of political, cultural, materialist perspective on aesthetics and the phenomenological perspective on aesthetics, and you know, that's not something that, it's not that this has never been bridged. You know, like at least, you know, work that influenced me a lot is the book Ugly Feelings by Sianne Ngai, which everyone should read. I might actually assign a chapter if I can get a PDF, but really like astoundingly good sort of like bridge, sort of, I don't know if bridging is the right, again, triangulation of philosophical aesthetic discourse, the sort of like new criticism style, formalist literary critical discourse, and then sort of like cultural materialist like affect theory, and then sort of like structural Marxism. And well, I think that what the sort of like discourse of differentiable programming can do is, you know, well, you know, I'm not thinking it's going to sort of like create this path where none existed, because some people have been doing great work forging this path, you know, between the phenomenological point of view in aesthetics and the structural political point of view in aesthetics. But I think it can sort of illuminate pretty deeply exactly what are the sort of like formal operations that keep this, you know, that keep this path open. Exactly, sort of like what kind of transformations are we applying when we take, for example, like aesthetic analysis and turn it into like ideological analysis. You know, ideological analysis both in the sort of like classic hermeneutics of suspicion sense, but also, you know, in like broader, like more lively, that sort of like, you know, you take some sort of like aesthetic, for example, you take some sort of like aesthetic mode or like mood or vibe that emerges from a work of art, and you suddenly find yourself sort of like projecting it like on a big screen as something that's implicitly a vision for like a way society could be, or a vision for a way society is without knowing that it is, or a vision that society once was without us realizing it was such. Sorry, it's sort of like trying to do this like sampler of like, oh, it can be like utopia, it can be like critique, it can be historical analysis. So, but what I mean is this sort of what you might call the sort of like the, I don't know, the sort of like the fundamental aesthetics to politics homology. You know, when you find some sort of way of being that a work of art has, and you have this either discursive or intuitive or both way of projecting that into a model of a political or societal or like structural like way of being. You know, I think I often find this like transition incredibly mysterious, even when I find it like successful or robust. And you know, one thing that I hope is that we can sort of use the cognitive computational science perspective to try and make this, transubstantiation of of an aesthetic vision to a political vision, or of like an aesthetic vibe into a political mode or like way of being, somehow like make this transubstantiation seem less like hocus pocus.
Yeah, but the way to go about that, I mean, this is where I think technology holds a lot of weight, because, I mean, if we take aesthetics and phenomenology, so phenomenology is
everyone else feel free to like barge in. I feel like we're doing discussion now. Go ahead though.
But okay, so if we take phenomenology in the Merleau-Ponty sense, okay, so there are certain things that are quantifiable in this, despite, as you said, the hocus pocus side of it. And this has been written about by Paul Smith from the University of Warwick in relation to Cézanne's paintings. And basically his hypothesis is that when we look at Cézanne, you can draw absolute parallels between what Cézanne was realizing, what was happening in the act of seeing, and what revelations that have taken place in neuroscience that Cézanne would have been completely unaware of. So in that sense, there's certain things there which tie over with neuroscience, which makes phenomenology to a certain extent quantifiable. And I think that's a necessary thing, because in order for phenomenology to move forward, and for aesthetics as well, and this is where also Rancière sets us up for a point of right to make a sort of exit from this tradition of aesthetics as something which is hierarchical, it's a regime, and it's only to the privileged. This is again why, I mean, formalism is both a good thing and a bad thing. Formalism is good in that it's determinate, and the indeterminacy of art is another problem. Formalism is bad as in it's only to the privileged. But for both aesthetics and phenomenology to move forward, I mean, there needs to be some sort of like a decolonizing of it.
Because try and open this into something that can maybe be more of a group discussion, which is, I think, maybe the question that's emerging for me right now, that we might sort of like, try and devote a little bit, or maybe the rest of this introductory section to. That's, well, I think everybody who's present introduced themselves, right? So I've been sort of, gently pushing the point of view that I guess that putting this discourse of computer science in, sort of like between sort of like poetry, aesthetics, philosophy, and politics is not like only possible, but I don't want to say necessary, but I'm going to say good. And that, like, the reason that I think that is apparently not what Andrea, the phenomenologist I mentioned, sort of like mentioned is like, oh, is that like why you want it? Do you want it in order to be able to sort of have this like absolute ontological like basis for all these like subjective things? And I think it's not that. I think that there's some kind of need for, I don't know if intermediary is like the word, but I don't know. We're missing a sort of like like a little like Hermes that can sort of like act as like a go-between. I guess it just is an intermediary, that sort of like emissary between the discourses of like aesthetics, structural politics, phenomenology, and so forth. And I guess this also means that like that I think that something is broken, right? If I think that this can like fix it or like help fix it, that I think that there is, or at least it's like even when there's sort of pathway between, let's say, the example I've been using, the sort of like subjective phenomenological and the structurally political when it comes to art, even when this pathway is sort of like well configured critically and theoretically in terms of broad contours, like it is like I think like the work of like Sianne Ngai, for example, the actual process of like, you know, of like what determines the I don't know if like what determines it, you know, it's like what exactly like happens when a certain phenomenological experience of like art acts as the model of a certain political reality or possibility or understanding or ununderstanding. I feel like there's sort of like, I don't know,
But there's an
upsetting amount of like mystery there, and that maybe computer science can help. You know, look sort of like look at it like saying looks at the now both sounds very computer sciencey. Another way to say it, like, you know, to think of like not just like the fact that sort of like add an understanding of like process, right? Because I feel like these are things, the sort of like phenomenology, politics, sort of like homology or connection is like a place where I guess we're sort of like, I've never saw sort of like people in the humanities or elsewhere develop any kind of like sophisticated discourse on the actual process by which one becomes the other. But I guess I want to hear from people, you know, what do you feel, you know, computer science, discourse of computer science or any kind of related discourse can sort of like do within the you know, within like the discourse of, I don't know, critical theory / like aesthetics / like politics / phenomenology larger, you know, basically, you know, what do you think this is for? I guess I want to ask like everybody. You know, obviously we're all interested to some degree in bringing computer science into this nexus that we're all, I guess, operating in to some extent, which is like the nexus of aesthetics, literary theory, art practice, and sort of like structural, like Marxist political theory, and I guess, you know, in this case also for many of you more sort of like practical design theory or design practice. So, you know,
I think one
what way are we to get out of it, and you know, maybe somebody new can.
I'll just to add one point is that I think that a handy thing for this, considering that we're talking about trying to have these talk about like functional transdisciplinary things that do take on this aspect of aesthetics, but computer science and the socio-political. It would be worthwhile if people can to, you know, to try and bring up some sort of case studies. I'm not talking about like presentations so much as just like, here's an example of something, because to give things grounding is quite good. I mean, an example would be like, okay, so an art project which ties in aesthetics, post-colonial theory, decentralization would be something like Nora Al-Badri and Jan, I can't think of his name right now, I'll put a link in the classroom. What these artists did was, so there's this ancient sculptural piece, but that was excavated in Egypt, brought to Berlin, and no one's quite sure about, you know, there's different stories as to how it got here. And if you look at different news broadcasts, you'll see different versions of the story. But so these two artists, they went into the Neue Museum in Berlin. They brought in a Connect scanner, so this 3D scanner. They brought it in covertly because you're not meant to take any pictures. They took a scan of it, made a 3D rendition of it, and then put it on display in Egypt. Now, the point of this is that it brings up certain things to do with aesthetics and aesthetics of computation. It also brings up phenomenological in the sense of what does the person experience subjectively when they view this in Egypt. There's also the decolonization aspect. But that's what I'm saying, is that's kind of an artwork that you could take, and I'll put it in the classroom, of something that's kind of ticking some of the boxes that you're talking about, Peli, in terms of like trying to find out some things that are operating in different areas.
I think that could be an interesting like, you know, experiment we could do in one of the classes maybe of, you know, trying to sort of look at a work of art, if you want to ascribe to some claim to sort of like, greater sort of like significance or impact in terms of, I don't know, like influencing or facilitating change in, or, enabling a reinvention of, I don't know, the way that we operate like in the world, and sort of like trying to think through how would we actually sort of like understand this kind of like cognitive, philosophical, political event in space and time, sort of like in a step-by-step way. But does maybe say anything about what they're hoping computation theory can do for the aspects of like art that you're interested in?
So there. Hi. Can I mind if I jump in, Meredith?
Oh yeah, everybody should.
I wish my video was on, but I'm on my mobile. But so I have a bunch of areas. So I think that Terrence's point was really was very interesting. Is sort of the utility aspect of technology, and I think there's so many different areas that you could focus on. And one thing that's been really meaningful to me for a long time, that has been coming up, I guess, in the last New Center class that I took, is the idea of transduction. And I think there's different philosophical ideas about what this means. But the computer for me is the engine where you can take one signal and turn it into another. And I feel like you see this a lot with new musical. I feel like you see a lot of bad art in a way that does this, because.
Oh wait, you mean transduction? Not the statistical concept, not like the kind of induction, the other transduction.
Yes.
Like transducers, they're like signal transformers, right?
Yes, exactly. And I feel like you see this a lot with like musical interfaces, right? I'm going to, and I remember seeing this like 15 years ago with the Uber organ. I'm going to make these dots, and I'm going to use a photocell, and I'm going to transform that into a mechanical bagpipe organ. These sort of, I'm going to take one kind of signal and turn it into another.
Right.
I'm going to take one kind of political activity and turn it into an aesthetic representation. I mean, you see this a lot. I have on the tip of my tongue the British artist who does. I'll think of it and I'll put it in the classroom notes. But I mean, this is very prevalent. It sort of is it's not data visualization, but it's sort of like reinterpreting one signal as another signal. I feel like the computer, because all information is equal in a way. But then the struggle is how to make it not this random. What is I hate to use necessity because it's so loaded, but what is the right way to what is the correct operation to transform one signal into another? I mean, that's one thing that I'm sort of interested in, but
No, yeah, that's super interesting, and I feel like the conceptual connections of we haven't gotten into like deep learning for everyone yet. Only some of you sort of like have like a background, but in terms of the sort of like the fundamental question of generalization in deep learning, feel like thinking about it as like a kind of like transduction, in the signal processing sense is like really interesting, right? Because basically, you like learn, you sort of like learn sort of like you sort of get imprinted with a pattern by a particular batch of objects, and you then try to just like take this pattern and apply it to like another batch of objects, sort of like hoping that that it's going to sort of like survive the shift in context, and in actually certain kinds of like deep learning, if you especially the kind that we're going to be talking about in the class, which is unsupervised deep learning. So often sort of like literally what you're doing when you're sort of like using a learned model to interpret some new set of object is sort of like turn the new objects into the old objects and then analyze them. Like, oh, if these like new objects where the objects that they already learned, what kind of set of, what kind of like subset of the objects they already learned they would be. So I feel like, thinking about the connection between like, I guess thinking about like, does the process of like learning and then applying what you learn to like new objects or like a new context or like a new domain, thinking of this as a kind of transduction operation, where you're trying to transform, basically, some way applying learning always means transforming like the new into the old, right? You have the things that you've observed and you're trying to now understand, the new observation in terms of the old observations. But as we'll see, in time you probably already know, there are certain like aspects of like deep learning where this seems to like apply extra literally. You really are sort of like, acquiring, sort of like extracting the pattern from some set of objects, and then you sort of like use it as a transducer to understand new objects in terms of their like projection into the universe formed by the set of objects that you've learned to understand. And well, actually, also, and often there are some applications where this actually is being turned into sort of like pure acts of transductions. Recently, there's this amazing new model called CycleGAN, which sort of like, you can teach it how to like turn a picture of like a forest in winter into a picture of like that same forest like in summer, or a pile of oranges into a pile of apples, or it's very good to turn like zebras into horses and horses into zebras for some reason. Horses and zebras are like huge in CycleGAN. But the amazing thing is that like you never teach CycleGAN, this model, what should be paired with what. You not even like not even as fundamental examples. You just give it like two sets of things. You give it like a set of horses and a set of zebras, and you sort of like push it to find some kind of isomorphism between them that it can carry out consistently, and it ends up sort of like with pairings that, or at least it often ends up with pairings that like humans find to be sort of like the correct transformation. That is, it ends up like pairing a horse to the zebra, where you do think, oh yeah, if this horse was a zebra, then it would be this zebra, and if the zebra was a horse, then it would be this horse. So yeah, I think transduction, the transformation, I guess, of one signal to another signal that's in some sense homological to it, right? I don't really know the proper definition of transduction signal processing, but yeah, I think you're right. It's like something where transduction goes really deep, both into the sort of like technical foundations of deep learning and into sort of like all art practice and all sort of critical theory practice for sure. We're all sort of like sort of like always just like trying to like posit and legitimize like strange transductions. So that is super interesting. I think trying to have this like play out as like we go on as like a new conceptual pillar we might keep referring to, because I really like this idea of like transduction, structure preserving transformation, I guess, as a conceptual universal that like slices through the domain of computer science and technology and art and sort of like critical and like especially critical theory. Yeah, I feel like honestly that's one of the things that we should maybe aspire to do in this class. Think about concepts that seem to sort of like be sort of like well abstracted enough that they neither become like metaphorical when you apply them to like art, nor like become like metaphorical when you apply them to like computer science, you know, nor to like politics. They just like seem to, you know, be topic, be, I guess, like structural enough that they just like do apply, or they just like can be applied, as far as we can tell, pretty much literally across all these domains. And I think transduction is a really exciting, you know, potential concept of this kind. I think actually that's a great like agenda to add to the class. You know, asking sort of like the general question of what concepts might we be interested in as, you know, as concepts that seem to act sort of like with equal literalness in the domains of like phenomenology, art, computer science, technology, and structural politics. So awesome.
Cool.
As you can see, you know, I'm trying to shape the future of the class a little bit based on what's coming up now. So, you know, definitely everyone should like intervene, because this is, you know, your chance to determine what the path of the class would be. So ends with some sort of, you know, agenda that they have in terms of what they're hoping to get out of, again, adding computer science or differential programming concepts to this mix of art, phenomenology, structural politics, aesthetics, philosophy, and so on. So we're going to sit quietly until a new person barges in and lays down the agenda, because I know not everybody is, you know, has like as easy of a time speaking.
Does anybody else want to talk about what you would like class to be? We haven't heard from Seth, TextGen, or TXGen, or Tegan. I'm not sure how to say your name. Monica, Martina, or Frederick, or Adam.
I'll read TXGen's. Tegan. I'll read Tegan's chat out loud, if that's okay for everybody.
Tegan.
Sorry, I can't read like Arabic letters, even though I did study it in elementary school. I'm not a super good linguist. So it says, I go by Tegan. I am based in Kansas City, Missouri. I'm an undergraduate dropout, but a tutor on the works of Guattari, political philosophy, history. I'm training in full stack development to build a communicative platform which applies Venn games, self-management to the group social media. Aspirations to work within the boundaries of new media art, having secured funding for my first solo show. I currently independently tutor political philosophy. My writing discusses Sun-Ra's conception of intergalactic music, finding overlap between Sun-Ra, Real, Land, and Fisher, the political philosophy of Afrofuturism, a reinterpretation of schizoanalysis, and the history and future of insurrection. Okay, cool. It was like a cool, like, vintage sort of like the Les Guattarian, like schizoanalyst in the class. That's going to be fun. Actually, it's like it's going to be interesting because I don't speak Deleuzian very well, but then on the rare instances when I do, I feel like I agree. You know, I feel like in some sense, like my project has like a very strong, like transcendental empiricist aspect to it, to the extent that like I understand what transcendental empiricism is, or just, you know, the concept of like vibe to me is a transcendental empiricist concept in as much as it deals with sort of like, you know, material systems that sort of like carry that carry structurally their own sort of like transcendental schema. I think of like vibe as a sort of like materially embedded transcendental schema. Like the vibe of a system in a way is the transcendental schema that the system's structure applies to itself. I think it's going to be really interesting because this is like a discourse that I've never felt totally fluent in, but on the other hand, to the extent that I do interact with it, it always feels very structurally and ontologically congenial to the perspective I'm coming from. At least as far as like, I guess it's something we haven't like talked about like this much, but because this is sort of like a general phenomena about computation, about the humanities, and more specific to my like theory of vibe stuff. But part of the theory of like vibe thing is like I'm very interested in the sort of like externalization or like reification, but in the good, in a nice way, of classically phenomenological concepts like mood. So I'm very interested in the idea of like vibe as objectivized or like reified or materialized or embedded mood. Like a vibe is what I think of as the mood of like a worldly system, which both acts of like as a schema for itself and potentially as a schema for interpreting like other system in accordance with itself. And then because I think of a worldly system as having a schema in that sense, that is, it has like the schema sort of like structurally appropriate to it. I can think of like a worldly system as having like a transcendental subjectivity or like a Kantian subjectivity, in as much as having a sort of like transcendental or Kantian subjectivity is at some level just like the same thing as having an interpretive schema for the material world. So the idea is of like, oh, there are certain material systems that have like a structure that in some sense gives us they have sort of like internal to them a structure that is like the schema that's like perfectly suited for interpreting them. But then as much as it's a schema, it can also be applied to the interpretation of other things, or it's going to be less perfect in the sense that it's going to drag those other systems into the schema of like that system. And then I'm like, oh, well, that's what like subjects do. Subjects like drag material worlds into schemas. So I can talk about, a thing in the world has a vibe, whatever, like a meadow has like a pastoral vibe. New York has like a New York vibe. A goth club has like a goth vibe, as something that in some ways like an object, like a material structural like subject, because, well, what is a subject? The subject is a mode of interpretation, or or like a transcendental schema of interpretation, and those like systems that seem to sometimes carry a schema of interpretation in them in a way that's like intrinsic to their like material structure. I think of them as having in some sense some aspect of like what it is to be a subject. So that's the way that my sort of like own personal project in this space that we'll be exploring, the space of I don't know, mathematically, computation theoretically augmented humanities. So that's the way that like my project in this space is, I think, very like congenial to a kind of like the Lisingwitterian thing. But I'm not sure. Do you have audio now, or are you still text only?
I can speak.
Oh, go ahead. Or are you happy with
I'm not sure I wanted to really say much more than that. I can.
What sort of like what's your agenda for the classes, or?
So what sorry, my dog is, calm me down, please. I wanted to, I guess, expand a little bit more about my background because I am an undergraduate dropout and I'm pretty young, so people kind of tend to get confused as to where I went from university to what I do now. I came to the Lisbon from an insurrectionary point of view, I guess, trying to discover, I guess, my own sense of praxis in a way, trying to figure out what I felt needed to be done. And so that was kind of my segue into reading the Lisbon, and I understood very little of it at first. And so I kind of gave myself a training in philosophy as much as I could, trying to discover like what texts to read, things like that, and just reflecting on them and spending a lot of time doing that.
Is that before or after undergrad?
This was started maybe 6-7 months before undergrad.
Oh.
Yeah, and once I'd gotten into undergrad, once I'd begun my undergraduate studies, I was to be a major in Middle Eastern studies, which at my university was not a thing. So I was going to effectively double major in religious studies and history. But I could get it as on my, at least like documentation saying I was a Middle Eastern studies major. And so I had, of course, taken a lot of courses within that context. But I had also taken a course with one of my favorite professors, Abigail Sussex. She is a new media artist, and she works with a lot of art theory with regards to new media, and introduced me to a lot of the background to surrealism, I guess, because I had no real conception of art history besides having taken like AP Euro in high school. So I kind of used that as a point to kind of begin an in-depth study of Guattari for that next 9-10 months.
Also code?
Yeah,
Cool.
That's something more recent, I would say. That's been since I left my undergraduate studies. I have been sort of independently studying, but also with a tutor, and I go to this co-working space that kind of has a lot of people around to help you with things at certain times. So it's not just on my own, but I have been sort of independently learning full stack development,
Awesome.
working with the mean stack mostly. And mean and MERN are the two stacks that I really care to.
Actually, what is full stack development? Because like I'm not like involved in like practical coding like at all.
Yeah. So I'll give the best explanation I can, which probably will be a bad one. I don't know. But within development, there is the front end and the back end. The front end being what the user sees and interacts with, and the back end being where the data is stored. And yeah, I think that's the best I can do.
You're doing all of them?
And full stack would involve all of it. There would also be, you could speak of a front end developer and a back end developer.
Right.
And so full stack would be the whole.
The full, like both. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm, as much as like I ever code, I'm like the opposite. Like I can write like pretty like decent, despite TensorFlow code when it comes to like the actual like neural nets. But then like if I have to like even like do the input pipeline, I'm like sobbing on the floor. Wow, a really incredibly exciting group. I have to say, I'm so excited for this class. So, okay, a few, I guess, structural questions, as I go to determine the structure of the class for the weeks ahead. So I guess first of all, have many of you or any of you already read any of my my work in this genre of mathematically informed literary theory? Have you read theory of vibe, or the lectures on Medium, or because I'm not sure whether it's best to teach these things, or have the things be sort of background and have us sort of try to come up with new things, or do a mixture of the two. But I guess I'm interested in hearing would you like the class to sort of okay, I guess here are three elements. There can be there's the element of introduction of sort of literary, theoretically and philosophically inflected introduction to deep learning, or more specifically to autoencoders and unsupervised deep learning and feature learning. There's the aspect of sort of just teaching the sort of the theoretical thesis that they lay out in theory of vibe, which is my sort of paradigm of how deep learning concepts apply to this sort of art, aesthetics, structural politics, phenomenology nexus. And there is the option of doing more exploratory stuff, talking about this sort of broad philosophical question of what the discourse of a computation can and can't do, and what things it can do aren't necessary, and to what end, and really sort of asking what's the place of the discourse of computation in the order of discourses, or what place do we feel or think they should have in the order of discourses. So I guess the concrete question is, and maybe you could all vote in the chat. Who would like the class to include probably hour-long, accessible / literary-theoretic introduction to autoencoders? If you can write yes or no, whether you'd like to have 60 minutes that's just stuff is a very fairly rigorous guided tour through the conceptual territory of autoencoders, and what the technical details are, and how I think that the technical details relate to fundamental concepts in aesthetics and philosophy. This is this is work that already exists already to read. You can find a piece, an introduction, a literary theorist introduction to autoencoders on my Medium page, but you might want to have sort of a classroom instruction of it anyway. So if I can get a yes or no, that would be helpful. So maybe everybody take a moment to think and then write yes or no in chat. And the question is, would you like to possibly, I guess, in the next section, the next class, have an hour devoted to going through deep learning and autoencoders, their mathematical foundations and their philosophical and literary, significance. Okay, we have one yes, yes. Okay, I'm getting a general yes feeling. So now we're switching to speak now, forever hold your silence with regards to, okay, awesome, great. So, okay, so we know that next class we're going to start with like an hour-long guided tour of autoencoders. Okay, would you like to do your own presentations in, let's say, like the last class? I mean, are you interested in sort of like us, talking, I'll talk with each of you in like private, and we'll decide on some kind of short, like, like research like assignment where you're like look into some like topic that you're interested in that intersects with the subject of the class, and do let's say 10-minute presentation on it in the final class. So so you can have sort of like your own computational high theory humanities pet project to develop. Cool. Okay, so we basically know what the second class will be, and we know kind of what the fourth class would be. I guess the third class can be a mystery to figure out after we have the second class and see how this goes. Just because it's like I feel like there's so many directions that like one can go, because I have I'm here partly to talk about this project that I worked on for like 7 years. But then I'm also here to talk about the potential, in my opinion, of like projects of that kind. And then I'm also here to, try and give some of the technical background that I think can facilitate thinking through projects of that kind. So we have this sort of like, the book report on my dissertation aspect. We have the me trying to impart some conceptual tools for doing computational high theory humanities aspect. And there's the aspect of hopefully all of us together like exploring this potential terrain of high theory computational humanities, and what it's good for and what can we do in it. So I think we'll try to balance these three things. Sorry, dry mouth. Okay, so in the, I think, 10 minutes that we have left, I want to maybe talk about another like major theme of this class for me, something that has been left out a little bit. I know this is, well, I guess it's not only like a hobby horse of mine. It's something that's like relevant to the sort of like ethos of the new center at large, which is I'm very interested in the claim of art to being an instrument of knowledge, not just an instrument of action, and not just like an instrument of expression, I guess, but also an instrument of knowledge. I'm not loving this like tripartite system of like action, expression, and knowledge now that I came up with it. But so let me paraphrase. I feel like in terms of how we conceive of the significance of like artistic practices. There's broadly speaking two sort of like standard modes available. There is the sort of classic sort of like literary criticism, you know, the non sort of like critical theory variety, where it's like art is an expression of things that we feel and think, and art is, you know, important or good or whatever, or art is like a part of, you know, what it is to like be human, because art allows us to express our subjectivities to one another. And, you know, that's the sort of like, I don't know, New York Times book review slash, you know, James Wood slash, you know, in the fancier versions of like Harold Bloom, I guess. I'm being really facile here, but anyway, sort of like understanding of like, oh yeah, romanticist literary criticism, thank you, right? And it sort of like started off, you know, when it was, you know, when it was like the actual like British like romantics. German romanticism is very, very different, but the actual British romantics, obviously, it was, you know, it had like its own like, it had to like break a lot of like discursive like limits to like get there. But nowadays it's yeah, it's sort of like the default sort of like you know, fancy book club. Oh, 5 minutes. Okay, great. So, and then like there's the other where we sort of like conceive of art as in the realm of action. You know, it's like, oh, this is an intervention. You know, it's like, you know, it's the intervention model of art. It's like, oh, my practice is an intervention in blah. My, you know, the intervention slash gesture slash like action like model of art. And something that's I feel like often like a little bit lost, or well, it's something that has like, it's something I guess it's like that lives within two traditions most, like the tradition of high modernism, like, you know, like Gertrude like Stein, like James Joyce like type like high modernism, and I guess that specifically the like French like avant-garde tradition, you know, so like surrealism, and I guess maybe European in general, so like surreal. Sorry, I lost my thread of thought because I'm stressed about the time. Anyway, the point is that like I'm interested in this this like possibility of like looking at art as basically the creation of, you know, a cognitive technique in the same sense that math is a cognitive technique, or that you know, a language is a cognitive technique. I'm interested in like art and like artistic methods as a way to create practicable knowledge of like the world and of like worldly systems, and of improving sounds. So like, oh, optimize this, optimize that. Let's say like improving our capacity to operate within the world. So I'm interested in like the capacity of art, not just like to express our feelings or what have you, but also not just to intervene in the sense of, you know, nudging, pushing, but in the capacity of art to actually, you know, reveal things about systems that exist in the world and like transform us through that, transform us the way that like knowledge is always intrinsically transformative. So this is going to be, you know, a big part of like my own like agenda in this class, which is like, you know, to push this like understanding of art where the center of gravity is the creation of knowledge, not necessarily, I guess it has to also be in defensive Foucauldian sense of like whatever, creating discourses of knowledge, but I just mean the creation of knowledge in the sense in which, like, when you do arithmetic, you create knowledge, or, when you do science, you create knowledge, and so forth. So like art as being very like continuous with the traditionally rational modes of inquiry, and this gets us back to like, Baumgarten and this idea of like poetry or literature is the like ars analogus rationalis, the like art, the art of the analog of reason, this like other like mode of engagement that basically does the same thing that reason does, only by slightly other means. I'm very, very excited to talk to you all, next week, and also, talk to you privately in between. I think we're going to have a great time. You look like an amazing group. Thanks so much. See you soon.
Thanks.
And contact me about like anything that you might want to ask. Also, if anyone at any point doesn't understand something I'm saying or somebody else is saying and wants clarification, there's such like a mixture of like backgrounds here that like nobody is gonna like understand like everything. So always like feel free to like intervene and ask. Also feel free to like zone out and like observe something ambiently. I do it like a lot when I go to, sometimes I go to like higher math lecture. I don't know like that much like higher math, but can still sort of like just like absorb something in a like a vibe way. So, feel free to always make your own choice about whether you want to understand something and have something be explained to you, or just like, zone out until it veers back to a place that where you're more familiar. Both options are like extremely legitimate and encouraged. You should feel comfortable doing either one. Thanks so much. I'm going to log off. Please all contact me with anything you might want to talk about. Bye.
Thank you so much, Peli.